CSS with basic validation. This is the form that we are going to be building up today. There is a sign-in form and a sign-up form. Starting with the sign-up form, we have 3 input fields, one for the username, one for the email address, and one for the password. And the user has the option to sign up. Inside the sign-in form, we have 2 input fields and also a checkbox. Now we'll be learning how to design this login form. I have uploaded the code for this login form in GitHub. I'll mention the links in the description down below. And now let's get started. Here I'm using brackets as a code editor. I have already created 2 files, index.html and style.css, and I will use the live preview option right here to see the output as we code. Let me resize it. Now starting with the HTML head and body tags, let's mention the link to the style sheet. And I'm going to start with the hello world text. In this login form design, I'm going to use a Google font. To do that, go to fonts.google.com and search for the font that you want. For now, I'm going with IBM Plex Sans font. We can get the code by easily selecting the plus icon to the right of the font, and we'll just copy the code and paste it in our file. As you can see, as soon as I mention the font family, the font in our web browser changes. Now that we are done with mentioning the font family, let's move on to the form design. Starting with the sign in and sign up tabs, I'm going to mention them as radio buttons so that it would be easier for me to switch between tabs, and then later we can design it to make it look like actual tabs. Now when I open the browser, you can see sign up and sign in radio buttons. As I've mentioned earlier, right now they look like radio buttons. Later on, we'll make it into tabs with the help of CSS. Here, the radio button is selected only when I click on the circle. It doesn't get selected when I click on the text. This isn't normally the case. So to fix this, we need to link both the radio buttons and the text. We can do that easily by using the label tag. Inside the label, we need to mention for which the label stands for. So we need to mention the ID inside the for property of the label tag. Now they are linked. So when I open the browser, you can see when I click on the text, the radio button is getting selected. Now let's move on with the form design. Starting with a form tag, followed by a heading. I'm going to include each and every form input elements inside a div container. That way it is more easier for me to style everything. So I created a text field for entering the username. Now I'm going to mention an input field for email address. I'm going to mention the type as email so that HTML will perform its own basic validation for email. And then password. I'm going to mention the type as password so that the password is not visible to the user. Just like that. Whereas in email, the text is visible, but in password, it is not visible. Now let's finish it with a submit button. Now when you notice, when I click on the submit button, it throws an error for incorrect email address. Thanks to HTML basic validation, the developers no more need to perform validation manually. Alright, moving on to sign-in form. It is almost similar to sign-up form. We'll start with the form tag, moving on to header. Mention the username, password, and we'll mention a checkbox. And finally finish it with the submit button for it as well. With that, the HTML part of our login form is completed. Let's move on to the CSS part of the login form. Starting with the background image. Since I want the background to cover the entire screen, I'm going to mention the background size property and set it to 100% width, 100% height. Here I'm going to give a linear gradient to the background image. You can do that easily by mentioning the linear gradient in front of the URL property. Using RGBA, we can mention the opacity of the color for the linear gradient. This is a very useful feature if your background is so bright and you want to darken or lighten the background image so that the content of your web page stands out. Now when I open the browser, you can see the background is transparent and the color has changed. Now for the text, I'll mention the color as white so it will be more visible in our web browser. Now let's code the tab functionality in our login form. Since we start with the sign up tab, we need to hide the sign in form for now. So let's set the display to none. The sign in form should be displayed only when the user clicks on the sign in tab. Since we are using the radio buttons, we can use the checked selector to check if the user has clicked on sign in tab. By the tilde symbol, this indicates an adjacent sibling. So basically the sign in tab and form 2 element need to be under the similar parent for this to work. Oops, I was supposed to enclose the entire login form inside the login form div class, but instead I have enclosed only the radio buttons in it. So let's move the end tag of the div tag all the way down to end of the forms. Now the input button and the form are under the same parent. Also, I forgot to mention the hashtag in front of the ID. Now when we refresh and check, when I click on the sign in tab, the sign in form appears. Great, let's apply the same logic to the sign up form as well. I guess the logic here is self-explanatory. I'm going to simplify this code further by combining similar styles into one block and separating the individual selectors with a comma. As you can see, the functionality still works the same. Now I'm going to make a minor change for the tab that is not selected. I'm going to make it less transparent than the one that is selected. To do that, we'll use the not and the checked selector. Basically, it tells the tab that is not selected. The plus sign indicates the immediate sibling next to the element. Not all the element with the label tag, but the one next to the tab that is not selected. And let's set the opacity for it to 0.8. Now that we are done with the tab functionality, let's move on to design the basic login form. I'm going to bring it a little bit down by setting the top to 20%. And these properties do not work unless you set the position to absolute. I'll mention the left to 7%. Give it some width. It looks perfect. Now let's design both the tabs. Starting off with the radio buttons, I'm going to set the radio buttons display to none so that the icon disappears. I forgot to mention the dot symbol in front of the class name. Yeah, it works. Moving on to the text part of the radio button, I'm going to mention the width and text align. As you can see, the width is not reflected, and that is because the display is set to inline by default. We need to convert it to inline block for the width to be set. Now it works. Let's set the font size to 18 pixels. And I'm also going to set the cursor to pointer. So when I move the cursor towards the tab, it changes to a hand symbol. I'm also going to set a border bottom for the underlining effect. Now I want the border bottom to appear only when I select it. So I'm going to set the scale X to 0 initially. And when the radio button is checked, the underline must appear again. Well, this doesn't work because I've set the transition for the whole header. So the entire text is disappeared. So to fix this, we'll use the after selector, where we can give the underline under the after tag and we can make the underline disappear under the same. We need to mention display block and empty content and also give it some height. Well, we forgot to mention the after selector here. And since we want the label that is immediately next to the radio button, we need to use the plus symbol. Alright, that works perfectly fine. Let's move on to design the header of the login forms. Starting with the margin, font size, text align, give it a color, and done. Moving on to form inputs. I'm going to give it a border radius so it will have some curved edges. I'm going to give it some height, margin, width. I'm going to mention the border with 0 so there is no outline around the input fields. And also give some background color so it looks a bit transparent here. Some padding and color for the font. As you can see, the placeholder here is not so visible. So let's give some color for the placeholder. Now it is visible but also transparent. Now when I click on the text field, there is a border that appears. To disable that, we'll use the focus selector and set the outline to none. Also going to reduce the opacity for the checked text. Moving on to buttons, I'm going to start with margin, width, height, some border radius, set the text align to center, give this a background color, give the text color as white, set the border width to 0 so there is no outline, and done. So there it is, the completed login form design. The basic validation is already included in the HTML. For mandatory fields, we can use the required keyword inside the input element. And there you go. It would throw an error if the input field is not filled out. So there you have it, the basic validation for the login form using HTML and CSS without any JavaScript. Hope you liked it. Give me a thumbs up if you